Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Usually at the end of the week, I bring on Rob Larity to discuss the latest developments in geopolitics and markets, but Rob is on vacation. Hope you're enjoying gallivanting through southern England, Rob, if you're listening to this podcast. We had Chase at Pinecone Macro pinch hit for Rob last week. I was hoping to get cousin Marko to pinch hit this week, but he was also traveling this week. So here in the dog days of summer, all you're going to get is me, because here I am sitting at my desk. I'll also, just personal anecdote, as some of you may know, I have a daughter. She's 11 months old. I'm obsessed with her. She's sick for the first, I guess not for the first time. She had COVID, but for some reason that wasn't as scary. She spiked a high fever at the beginning of this week, and she's going to be fine. But first-time parent dealing with, fevers of 103, 104 degrees, I've kind of been a little bit all over the place in general. So that's where I'm coming to you from, but I still wanted to give you some content here at the end of the week to sum up the week. We've got some great content already recorded for you next week and for the weeks ahead. I actually just finished talking to Miles Stapleberg for our podcast about nuclear fusion, so some exciting content going forward, but this will be a little shorter than normal, and maybe some of you will like it. I've been getting requests for shorter content because you guys maybe don't like the long-form stuff that much. But in any case, I'm just going to run through the world, talk to you about the most important things I flagged on the CI Knowledge platform, and hope that me talking about that will make you want to sign up for the CI Knowledge platform and not just listen to these smooth bass notes as I talk about what's going on in the world. These are in no particular order, but the most important things that are on my desk this week. Argentina had primary elections going into general elections at the end of the year. A guy named Javier Milei, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, I'm just getting up to speed on that, won the most votes. Now, there's still, I think, something like over 30% undecided, so a lot here can change. But this guy is extremely weird. He has some of the weirdest hair I've ever seen in my entire life. And yes, I live in a country where Donald Trump was president. He used to be in a Rolling Stones cover band when he was a younger man. He has named his dogs after famous economists like Milton Friedman. He also is a self-professed tantric sex instructor, whatever that is supposed to mean. The jokes just make themselves. I don't even have to be funny. I can just talk about him. The reason this is so important, though, is because this is a major break in Argentine politics if he gets elected president. He is, like every other Argentine politician, against Argentina's big deal with the IMF. He's against the deal with the IMF because he doesn't think it goes far enough. He thinks that Argentina needs to be more like Ayn Rand, needs to be more sort of less government, more pull yourself up by your bootstraps, austerity, dollarize the economy, everything else. Now, there's a lot that's going to happen between now and when Argentina has its actual elections. But if he was elected, just the fact that he's in the running, that somebody with views like this has the most votes at this stage in the process, that tells you that something has really broken down Argentina at a political level. And I guess it's surprising that it hasn't broken down until now. I mean, Argentina has been an economic dumpster fire, literally going back to the 1990s. They are dealing with what looks like hyperinflation to me right now, so things are very bad. And it looks like, from a political perspective, Argentina is finally breaking. Moving, sort of staying in the same realm, I just want to say very briefly that drought in Panama is causing restrictions on the functioning of the Panama Canal and ships going through. And the Panama Canal Authority has now limited the number of ships that can go through the canal. I think it's down from 36 to 32. Not that big of a deal. It's actually kind of bullish our natural gas thesis here at Cognitive Investments, because it seems like LNG tankers are some of the ships that are going to be the most affected by this. In the grand scheme of things, a 10% reduction in flow via the Panama Canal, probably not that big of a deal to a global economy. But if things get worse from here, that could be a very big deal in terms of the global economy. So just something to watch. You're always watching, if you're a geopolitical analyst, you're watching the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, the Straits of Malacca, the Strait of Hormuz. Those are sort of the big four geopolitical choke points that I'm constantly checking in on every week. Once a week, checking how things are going in those four choke points. The Panama Canal flashing yellow on my indicators this week from that perspective. From there, I want to zoom out a little bit to talk about parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Now, we talked about the Sahel. We had a ton of great content about the Sahel last week. Niger's military junta continues to rule the country. Their hand-picked prime minister actually went to the country of Chad this week, so maybe there's some basis for negotiations there. The junta is not really showing that it wants to negotiate. That's the only real sign that we have there. There have been some more jihadist attacks in Mali and Niger. And again, as you know, if you listened to us last week, you know that's a big thing that we're worried about. We're worried about the rise of Islamic State or Al-Qaeda or other wannabe caliphates in the middle of the Sahel. That might really bring in France, the United States, or other actors. But that's not what's concerning me this week in Africa. I've got two main points on either ends of the Sahel. Number one, Ethiopia is flashing red again. So unless you've been living under a rock, you know that Ethiopia had a civil war. The Tigray region wanted autonomy. The federal government didn't want them to have autonomy. You had a pretty bloody and grisly civil war, and the federal government eventually brought the Tigray region to heel. There's a lot of deaths, a lot of casualties, a lot of food insecurity right now. But we thought that maybe Ethiopia was getting back to business as usual. But now the Amhara region and ethnic Amhara folks are getting targeted by the federal government because the federal government in Ethiopia, constantly wanting to centralize power, is now going after Amhara. And that's a big deal. There are reports of tens of people dead in drone attacks and fighting between Amhara militias and the federal government. You've also got reports of thousands of arrests in multiple Ethiopian cities. So the Tigray region, I even hesitate to call it a civil war. It was really an insurrection from a region that really didn't have a chance. Amhara is much bigger relative to Tigray, and that is a much more serious challenge to the Ethiopian government than even the Tigray civil war was. So maybe it'll turn around. Maybe the Amharas will back down. Maybe the federal government will back down. I don't know, but that is a big deal in one of Africa's most populous nations. Going to the other side of Africa, Western Africa, to Africa's most populous nation, Nigeria. Nigeria is the country that has to lead the charge if ECOWAS and Africa is going to do anything about Niger. But the thing that is concerning me about Nigeria is that, unlike in the United States and other parts of the Western world, inflation is increasing in Nigeria. Transport costs up, food costs up. Consumer prices rose 24% last month. That's the highest in September 2005. You might remember that Chase has talked about maybe being a little bullish Nigeria. If you've been reading the SITREP, you know that the new Nigerian president has been pushing through some much needed reforms, but that those reforms are already starting to translate into economic pain for Nigerians, so much so that he had to declare an emergency and offer support to keep food prices from spiraling out of control. So what's happening in the Sahel, really disturbing, really depressing, creating migration issues, everything else. But if we've got Nigeria and Ethiopia, two of the most populous countries in sub-Saharan Africa, on either end of the Sahel flashing red, that's a much bigger deal. And that's not just going to stay in Africa. That's going to reverberate throughout the world. And I have not even mentioned the civil war in Sudan, which is arguably the most depressing thing happening in the world. The UN says it's over 4.3 million people displaced now, thousands of people dead, just gut-wrenching reports of assaults on women and hundreds of children who have died in the fighting in general. Just a real block of instability, which it could create jihadist caliphates. It could create massive amounts of migration. It is already creating massive amounts of food insecurity. This is a part of the world that does not get covered on the front page, but a lot of disturbing things happening in sub-Saharan Africa in those parts of the world. From one optimistic story to another, Nagorno-Karabakh is also simmering with tensions. It's very hard to get information out of there, so I don't know exactly what's happening. But Azerbaijan, Armenia seems to be tensions there again. The reason I just bring that up, if you are a CI Knowledge Platform subscriber, you know that we very, very closely watch this conflict because a lot of airspace around Russia and Ukraine is closed right now. So air freight that is going through Eurasia actually has a fairly narrow corridor to go through. And if you take Nagorno-Karabakh, if you get fighting there, if you get fighting between Armenia and Azerbaijan such that airspace there also gets closed down, suddenly you're talking about major bottlenecks for air freight and things like that in the rest of the world. So it's not serious enough yet to get there, but that is one sensitive spot that we're watching. And there have been some renewed tensions there in general. I also wanted to talk for a couple minutes maybe about wheat. We've been long wheat here at Cognitive Investments for probably a couple months now, but we got stopped out of the trade yesterday. So despite all of the things that are happening in the Black Sea, wheat prices continue to go down. And I have to tell you, I'm a little mystified by it. One of the most interesting things that has crossed my desk this week is that India is apparently talking about importing 8 to 9 million tons of wheat from Russia on the cheap. You might remember at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war, India raised its hand and said, not only do we not need to import wheat from anywhere, we're going to export wheat abroad. We are going to help handle the grains crisis that is going to come from the Russia-Ukraine war. It took all of a month or two of bad weather for India to completely change course, and it wasn't going to export at all. Weather has continued to be bad in India, and India is facing rising wheat prices and has now apparently reached out to Russia, and Russia is willing to provide them with large amounts of wheat as India tries to drive the price down. This also links to high rice prices in Asia. So last year, Dan Bassi is the source of this comment that I'm about to make. What really prevented maybe a global type Arab Spring was that rice prices stayed low. That's not happening this year. And you've had India restrict rice exports. You've had some not restrictions in Thailand and Vietnam, but some changing contracts and things like that. Rice prices have been ascending. And if rice prices are ascending, you maybe move to wheat in general. All that said, and all the uncertainty that's happening in the Black Sea with Ukraine saying, all right, we're getting ships out of Odessa and we're going to attack Russian ships. And Russia says that the grain deal is not coming back. All of that, and wheat prices continue to fall. Something there doesn't quite make sense, especially when you start factoring in the food insecurity we're seeing in Africa. India may be needing as much as 8 and 9 million tons. The market is saying prices are going lower, and everything that I see at my desk says that they should be going higher. Now, when you're trading commodities, I was just talking to a good friend about this, that the market can maybe outlast the amount that you have in your bank account to stay in the market. The fundamentals will eventually assert themselves. We at least got stopped out here, and I'm a little bit confused. We're taking a step back. We will have to re-examine that. But hey, for the sake of the world, not for the sake of U.S. farmers, but for the sake of the world, hope those wheat prices stay low, because there's going to be plenty of demand for them going forward, if I'm right about some of those things. It wouldn't be a Cognitive Investments podcast if we didn't talk briefly about China. This has been a running refrain between in my conversations with Rob, really for the last 12 months. You've had more pressure in the real estate market. You even had some very small protests in Beijing after a shadow bank missed a bunch of payments. You've had it's been a couple weeks of really disturbing economic data coming out of China. China responded by cutting interest rates for the second time in 3 months, slashing them, according to the Wall Street Journal, that was their word, slashing them 15 basis points. For those of you at home, that's not that many basis points. If you're worried about an economic crisis, slashing interest rates 15 basis points is not going to do anything. That's shuffling chairs around the deck of the Titanic. There's a lot of sort of in both media and analysis out there talk about how maybe China doesn't know what it's doing. Maybe there are competing factions within China. China knows it doesn't want to do stimulus, but it also can't do the politically hard thing of redistributing wealth. So it's just stuck in this area in general. The one thing that I would go back to here is that Chinese economic decision makers know all of these things better than all of us. And for whatever reason, they think 15 basis points is enough. They think the state council's initiative from a couple weeks ago to incentivize consumption with more festivals and tax credits for EVs and things like that, they think that's going to be enough. So either, I can see three possibilities here. Either Chinese economic planners are completely stupid. I think that's a relatively low probability. They think it's not that big of a deal. They have access to data or access to information that says they think that they can maintain things the way they are without a stimulus happening, or there really is internal dissension within the Chinese Communist Party. Now, I thought that dissension wasn't there, and I've been saying that I think Xi Jinping has control, but even me can't help but look at the foreign minister being digitally disappeared. We haven't heard from him in months. Wang Yi has now taken over the foreign ministry. That PLA rocket force thing continues to stick in the back of my brain, and we're not getting the sorts of policies that would lead to redistribution of wealth or would help fix some of China's problems. Even me, the optimist about Xi Jinping's ability to control the Chinese Communist Party, is seeing some concerning things. But I also come back to that. Chinese officials know these things better than us. So rather than saying they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, or they're stupid or irrational or anything else like that, my instinct is to say they must see something that tells them that they can be more optimistic than everybody else is being about them. And they're not optimistic. They know they have problems. They're cutting interest rates, but they are seeing something. And maybe it's, like I'm saying, maybe they have data, access to data that says things aren't as bad as everybody else. Maybe they're seeing, well, the political cost of doing these other things isn't going to work, so we have to thread the needle. I'm not sure, but they see something that is preventing them from really going after stimulus or these other things to try and float the economy, and I think that's notable. Last but not least, another country that I have been relatively optimistic about, but which we're going to have a very special guest on the podcast in a couple weeks. I won't spoil that surprise, to talk about Germany. Germany has decided to make a U-turn on its commitment to spend 2% of GDP on its defense budget. And that's important because all NATO countries are supposed to spend 2% of GDP on their defense budget. And Olaf Scholz's sort of reimagining of German foreign policy said that Germany was going to start doing that annually starting in the next year. Now, the German government has thrown out that pledge at the last minute, and they've pledged to meet the 2% target on average over a 5-year period. And what does that mean? That means that Scholz doesn't have the level of power that we think, or that even he thinks he did. And we already know that looking at German polls right now. It's doubtful that the SPD would do anything, or would. I doubt they would be in the government if elections were held today. The AfD has been rising. CSU has been doing well. CDU, CSU has been doing well in general. But this is not the level of urgency that we would expect if Germany really was turning on a dime, if it was making revolutionary change. And this goes back to something I said about this particular German government when it took office. It doesn't have enough support. It is too fractious. It's too many different groups. You've got SPD, you've got the Greens, you've got the more fiscally austere guys. I can't remember their party off the top of my head here. But you put all those things together, you don't get a very stable government that has one mind. So we're probably going to have to wait to see a Germany that's really going to turn around. I say again, though, everybody who wants and pushes for, Germany should pull its weight. Germany should spend 2% of GDP on its defense budget. Maybe it's just my background and my family history. But if any country was going to underperform on its military budget, let it be Germany. I don't want to be, the previous times in history where Germany has been spending a lot on its military budget have not been particularly happy times, not just for my ancestors, but for Europe, for Eurasia, for the rest of the world. So careful what you wish for. I do think that Germany will have to wake up at some point, even if this iteration of this government is not the one that's going to wake up. But here today, I have to tell you, Scholz is not going to be that guy. Thought he might be. He talks a big game, but he just doesn't have the support behind him to help Germany turn on a dime. So I think at least here in the short term, we're looking at more of the same from Germany rather than some kind of revolutionary change. Okay, those are the most important things in the Knowledge Platform this week, the most important things that I'm watching as we go into the end of the week. Hope you enjoyed the solo cast. Hope you're all staying healthy and well. Cheers and see you out. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.